I think the United States congressmen are behaving very irresponsibly on the US-China contest, because they, instead of trying to carefully analyze the whole picture and figure out what are the long-term interests of the United States and how to advance these long-term interests in the United States, which will be a mixture of competition and cooperation within US and China. Instead, they are purely engaged in scoring political points domestically. And I think if you sacrifice your country's national interests in having a sober and sane relationship with China in favor of scoring domestic political points to enhance your personal career, you're behaving irresponsibly. So I think the American people need to speak out, therefore, and tell their politicians that the US-China issue is too important to be left to political grandstanding. Instead, they should step back and ask what is in the long-term interest of the United States and stop just trying to score political points against China. I can understand why American politicians, in an effort to win over support of the American people, say, oh, this is a contest within democracy and autocracy. And of course, in the English language, democracy is always good, autocracy is always very bad. So they would like to portray it as a simple black and white thing. But in my book, Has China Won, which has actually been translated and sold very well in China, I explain in chapter 7 that this is not a contest between democracy and autocracy. This is a contest between plutocracy in the United States of America, where public policy decisions are made not to benefit the population at large, but the public policy decisions are made to benefit a small sector of the population, the top 10%, top 20%. And that's why the standard of living of the bottom 50% of the America's population hasn't gone up in several decades. And I think a plutocracy is therefore at a competitive disadvantage when it has to deal with a meritocracy in China, because in China the leaders are selected on the basis of their experience and their ability to run provinces, to run cities, and so on and so forth. So therefore, in this sort of contest, where the meritocracy is working very hard to improve the standard of living of its own people, whereas the plutocracy is only interested in enhancing the benefits for the top 20%, this is a competitive advantage for a meritocratic system over a plutocratic system. And Americans should step back and reflect on this and ask themselves, how did this plutocracy emerge in the United States of America? And as you know, there is a lot of intellectual dishonesty in America when it comes to discussing the plutocracy, because the Americans believe that you should call a spade, right? And if you should call a spade, you should call a plutocracy. But of course, this would go against the political interests of the politicians, and therefore no politician in America dares to suggest that America has become a plutocracy, because in some ways it is the US Congress that is responsible for the creation of a plutocracy, because the US Congress takes money from very wealthy people to shape policies that will benefit the very wealthy people. And so since the US Congress is part of the problem in the creation of plutocracy, they are reluctant to discuss it clearly and openly. And that's going to be a competitive disadvantage for the United States. Predictions about the future are very difficult. And I mean, it's possible that China's economic growth may slow down dramatically And if China's economy, for example, grows at 2 or 3% a year, then it will not be able to overtake the United States, because the United States can also grow at 2 or 3%. So clearly, for China to overtake the United States, it has got to continue growing at 4 to 5 to 6% a year. And the question is whether or not you believe China can grow at 4 to 5%. And I actually believe that China can, because China is still educating hundreds of millions of people and raising their education levels, and people with a higher education level with access to capital and other resources are able to be economically more productive. And as they become more productive, their per capita GNP will go up. And if their per capita GNP goes up, the total GNP will also go up. So, it's important, therefore, to ask the simple question, can China's economy grow faster than the United States? And traditionally, a country with a per capita income of only 10,000, like China, should have the ability to grow faster than a country like the United States with a per capita income of over 60,000. I would say that I'm not comfortable with the term de-dollarization. It is true that many countries are trying to reduce their dependence on the US dollar, and this is an understandable trend among the countries in the world, because they have seen that the US government will use the US dollar as a weapon against you if you are seen to violate some fundamental interests and concerns of the United States. And of course, the most extreme example of this took place when the United States, together with its West European friends, froze the assets of the Russian central bank. Now, that is actually, in theory, a violation of the sovereignty of Russia, because the central bank assets belong to the sovereign country of Russia. But once the United States begins to seize the assets of other countries, it is natural for other countries to say, should I keep all my assets in the US dollar? What happens if the United States seizes my assets? And that's why there is a trend towards countries reducing their dependence on the US dollar. But at the same time, in practical terms, there is no substitute for the US dollar in the global economic system. So still, even today, even though countries are trying to sign trade contracts in other currencies like the renminbi, most of the trade in the world is still carried out in the US dollars. But trade actually is not the big area. But there's a huge amount of financial transactions that take place in the world. And about 90% of financial transactions in the world still take place in the US dollar. So even after China's economy becomes bigger than the US economy, let's say it happens within 10 years, the dollar will still remain the global reserve currency for a long time to come. And it'll be difficult for the renminbi to replace it unless China allows free flow of money in the capital accounts. And that's not going to happen soon. So in view of this, I don't see an immediate replacement for the US dollar. But within 10 to 20 years, if the United States continues to weaponize the US dollar, then it's possible that the role and influence of the US dollar will not disappear, but will diminish significantly. The United States denies that it is carrying out a containment policy against China. But it's interesting that quite serious commentators inside America, like Edward Luce of Financial Times, Farid Zakaria of Washington Post and CNN, Max Boot, another commentator, have all said that the United States is carrying out a containment policy against China. And I think it's important for the United States to assess whether such a containment policy can succeed or not succeed. I believe that unlike in the case of the Soviet Union, where the containment policy succeeded because the Soviet Union hardly did any trade with the rest of the world, but in the case of China, since China trades more with the rest of the world than the United States does, any effort to contain these Chinese trading relationships will fail, because the rest of the world is benefiting a lot from its trade with China. And that's why it'd be wiser for the United States, instead of going for a containment policy, should try to work out a policy of having agreed multilateral rules for all great powers when they interact with the rest of the world. And so, for example, in trading relationships, in investment relationships, in financial relationships, let's agree on a common set of rules that we work out at the relevant multilateral bodies like the United Nations, for example, like the World Trade Organization or like IMF. And so I think it's important, therefore, for the United States to consider the possibility that a wiser course than a containment policy would be a new, different form of engagement policy, but an engagement policy that takes place within multilateral fora, agreeing on a set of rules that all the countries of the world, including US and China, also agree on.